glad you could join us. Feel free to open your bags of chips while I'm talking. I see just as many new faces as I do regulars, so you're all going to get the introduction spiel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicole Finman. I'm the Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at KEI. And it is my great privilege to be introducing our speaker, Dr. Richard Weitz, who actually has been involved in this series, the academic paper series, longer than I have. Our academic paper series here at KEI is a year-round project. Twice a year, we send out worldwide calls for papers where we're looking for unique and timely topics regarding the Korean Peninsula that we think will add to the overall policy-relevant conversation. At the end, we publish those papers about every month, along with an open forum discussion program, such as this one here today. And then at the end of the year, we compile all the papers from the year into a single volume on Korea. We're actually in the final printing stages of the third blue book that will come out shortly. And it is in this green book, our first book, that Dr. Richard Weitz first authored a paper for the series. It was titled The Korean Pivot, Challenges and Opportunities from Evolving Chinese, Russian, and U.S.-Japanese Security Ties, and that was in 2007. But today he's here to contribute on another incredibly important, and if I may, underexplored topic, that is Russia's sort of presence and involvement with the Korean Peninsula. You have his bio in front of you. However, it is that remarkable. I do need to draw your attention to a few things. Dr. Richard Weitz is currently a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, where his research includes regional security developments related to Europe, Eurasia, and East Asia, as well as U.S. foreign defense, homeland security, WMD non-proliferation policies, and a variety of other things. Dr. Weitz also is a non-resident senior fellow at the Project on National Security Reform and a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. Before Hudson, you would have seen Dr. Weitz's name at the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Defense Science Board, DFI International, Belfer Center at Harvard, U.S. Department of Defense, the list goes on. He is a graduate receiving his BA from Harvard. He received a Master's in Science and International Relations at the London School of Economics, Master's in Philosophy and Politics at Oxford University, and his PhD from Harvard University again. He's published a lot on a number of things, and not only what you can infer from his bio, but in our previous experience with Dr. Weitz, it is the rigor and his approach, the exploration he takes on topics that we feel is incredibly valuable, and why we were so pleased to see him submit another proposal, and I am very happy to be here today introducing him. So with that, I will give you the floor, and after that we will open up for a discussion.
Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. Thank you so much to KEI for hosting me, and thank you all for coming today. Nicole is right. Russia's role in the Korean Peninsula Russia's role in the Korean Peninsula is often not followed very much, particularly in the United States. When we Americans think about the negotiations in North Korea, and especially China and South Korea, but Russia is not really often thought of, at least I mean, I'm sure in the government is, at least in the think tank community, perhaps in the scholarly community as well. But there are certain imperatives that make Russia's role of worthy study as well as sort of policy considerations. Particularly, Russia has, just by dint of geography, it's going to have some role, negative or positive, in what goes on in Korea. The Russians are very concerned about border countries and what happens on their border. Any U.S. or other action by another country towards North Korea is actually going to play into how Russia views that country. In terms of history, as we'll get into, they're very closely intertwined. Russia and Korea used to centuries of very intense interaction. Russia is bold, and tactics towards the Koreas are complex, like the other players, because you've got competing priorities. Sometimes they coincide, sometimes they don't, and then you have to make trade-offs. In general, I would argue that the economic objectives are a little easier to understand. From Russia's point of view, there's long-standing concern that a country has not been well integrated into the East Asian economic community, or the East Asian situation in general. The Russians like to think of themselves as a Pacific power as well as a European power and a Eurasian power, having interest in all three regions, but they tend to be sometimes sidelined in developments in the region. Certainly economically, the boom we saw during the last decade did not occur in Russia, the Asia after Russia, it was more in the European segment. Part of the way Russia plans to address this issue is ideally through resolving the North Korean situation, develop some kind of way by which Russia can use North Korean territory to integrate very closely into the more prosperous countries of East Asia, particularly that would be Japan, South Korea, and China. They're also picking up as well, obviously, and more broadly. Now, security goals is a bit more complicated. I'll elaborate on each of them later, but just to give you a sense of what they are. Initially, it's going to be ending. I think they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. I think they would like North Korea to curtail its missile defense program. On the other hand, they don't want to see the collapse of the DPRK regime abruptly or through forceful means. They have broader non-proliferation goals, rather than nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles throughout East Asia. And as I indicated earlier, Russia has a sense of the vision of itself, of Russian leaders as a major player in what goes on in East Asia. They want to be involved. And they have a series of tactics that derive from this, which pursue some goals, not others. Again, they're trade-offs. In terms of history, Russia created North Korea. The Russian troops occupied the peninsula at the end of World War II at the northern half. They had at the time, as we know, they had a series of allied communist parties in different countries. They used the opportunity to help the North Korean communists come control the northern half of the peninsula. And unfortunately, one of the legacies they left was the Stalinist model, which although Russia moved away from it, is still very popular in North Korea, the all-parent state that controls much of economic and political life. And what's interesting in the Soviet period, you had the state-to-state relations, but I think even more important were the party-party relations. So the DPRK, the party representatives often meet with the Communist Party Central of the Soviet Union representatives, independent of government relations. And a lot of policy was decided in that faction, and they used the government then to implement the policies. Particular twist, what happened was, as we know, at the time when North Korea was created, Russia and China were allied. They, particularly during the Korean War, after now established some consolidated control in China until 1929, a very close alliance in 1953. They both supported North Korea. There were always elements of tension. The Chinese had sent in the troops, the North Koreans supported the Russians. Soviets kept a bit of a distance from the process. The Chinese felt they should have gotten more help, and that just began the problem later. But at the time, they looked like they both had the same goal, and they were fairly close. Then, when the Sino-Soviet split occurred, you had this competition for influence between the two. This is still something of a factor, although a lot less important than less than. The North Koreans are very clever balancing off between Moscow and Beijing, trying to get as much as they want. And I still think that's a residual factor in North Koreans' approach. They tend to like to prefer to deal with the countries one-on-one rather than deal with them collectively in groups. When the Soviet Union collapsed, towards the end of the Soviet Union, and then during the first Russian period, we saw a major change under Boris Yeltsin. There were elements in the Russian government who really wanted to align with the West. and they really wanted to get away from North Korea, particularly the first Russian foreign minister had very negative feelings for North Korea as a political system. He found the values of Nazism. And there was also an economic imperative. Russia was no longer going to subsidize the North Korean economy. They were going to charge free market rates for oil and gas and the delivery. And what happened is North Korea couldn't afford this, so Russia trade with North Korea collapsed. The Chinese and French filled the gap for most of their areas. In return, what the Yeltsin government wanted to do is was hoping just to push to give up on North Korea and be able to use that as a mechanism to move closer to South Korea. And that worked to some extent. The South Korean government at the time, under President Roh had a policy of what's known as the resort policy. So he was eager to reach out to Russia and China and other countries that ties with North Korea as an indirect way to influence and gain some leverage over Pyongyang. So he gave Russia a major loan, which was very important at the time because the Russian economy was still, the transition period was very disruptive. $1.5 billion initially. But it actually didn't work out as well as the Russians might have hoped. What happened was because they gave up so much in Pyongyang and again North Korea, they really didn't have much influence anymore. And one of the reasons the South Koreans were eager to reach out to Russia was because they wanted to use Russia to help get some leverage over Pyongyang. And so the attractiveness of Russia to South Korea, that strategic geopolitical thinking, declined with the decline of the relationship. Afterwards, the whole 1990s, I think Russian diplomats were looked very negatively upon. They were pretty much excluded from what was going on in Korea. They had a very small role during the worst North Korean nuclear crisis when, as we now know, there was serious contemplation of military action in the United States to deal with the emerging North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities. They weren't involved in the Keto Consortium. They weren't involved in the four priority talks that occurred later between China and the United States and the two Koreas. So Vladimir Putin came in, and we know one of his ambitions has been to reestablish Russia's role as a great power. That includes in East Asia. And the way he's done that is by continuing to maintain good relations with South Korea, but also trying to restore some influence and leverage with North Korea and gain some access to that. So they renewed the Treaty of Friendship with North Korea. He became he made the first trip of a Russian/Soviet leader to go to Pyongyang. But Russia's also continuing to deepen relations with South Korea. They now have what they call a strategic cooperative partnership. The current issues, I'm not going to go into this because you guys all know this, the security talks are dominating the security realm, trying to lead to North Korea's denuclearization, but also as well as integration into East Asian community more broadly. I think in the old Lenin slogan, one step forward, two steps back, makes a lot of sense here because the talks have been going back and forth, and Russia and everyone else are frustrated by the whole process. Where we are now is, as you know, the North Koreans say they will go back to the security talks. They sometimes say they will go to nuclearization, but their main focus now is on developing bilateral relations with the United States, or some kind of dialogue. Russians have said they don't object to this. They welcome it as long as it's a mechanism to sustain the security talks, which is always something they value very highly. Other issue, the ballistic missile problems, is perhaps another legacy of the Soviet systems, since they appears that the Soviets gave the North Koreans the technology initially they needed to develop a ballistic missile capacity. And now the international community is concerned about the test, concerned about the transfer of technologies and missile elements to other countries. Now, economically, the Russian goal, as I said, is really trying to figure out ways in which they can integrate more closely with South Korea and Japan, perhaps through North Korea. So what they're looking now is the construction of a rail network that would link the Trans-Siberian Railroad with the railroad system that they would like to build through the Koreas. We're thinking about energy pipelines and other areas, but it can't realize this without the security dimensions of the Russians is very much interlinked. You have to solve the North Korean security crisis to be able to deal with economic issues, otherwise you can't get the North Koreans to open up sufficiently. Currently, the Russians' economic stakes in North Korea are minimal. As we said, never recovered from Gorbachev's decision sustained by Yeltsin to put everything on a free market basis, a hard currency basis with the North Koreans couldn't afford. There was a major obstacle for a while about the large North Korean debt that the North Koreans developed during the Soviet period. The Russians wanted some kind of payment, the North Koreans didn't really want to repay, or not that they could have even. And so eventually what the Russians have done, as they've done in many other cases, they've waived a lot of the debt in order to reach out to new economic opportunities in the future. And that has made a lot of sense in the case of Algeria and a few other Soviet clients, because you can have new arms deals and so on. So far, it hasn't really worked in North Korea yet. At the moment, the border is sealed, for the most part, for commerce. What the main economic involvement of North Korea with Russia is the North Korean laborers that are now working in the Russian Far East under various auspices. They work on a lot of timber construction projects. They obtain some income, but that transfer a lot of it back to the Russian government, or Russia accept a lot of free labor to Russian intermediaries. And I can see why North Korea wants to go that route, because unlike Quezon or some other arrangements, the minimal occupation, the free market practices, or the network practices, because these are North Koreans off somewhere else not a hostile country, and it gives North Korea some income. And the Russians are happy because they're really trying to develop the Far East Siberian situation. South Korea trade is, despite the absence of the desired North Korean transit route, is increasing heavily. Bilateral trade in 2008 was almost $20 billion, and it's fallen off of course in 2009 because of the fall of World War causes and other problems, but it should come back. The Russians see a natural partnership between South Korean investment into Russia. They're really trying to encourage that. Russia has the resources that need to be exploited: oil, gas, minerals. The South Koreans, and in theory the Japanese, if they could ever resolve the island crisis, it would be logical people to come in, invest, and develop those resources using high technology. And they've given various special tax privileges to South Korean businesses. They tried to set up an industrial park, but it's still a bit early on. I think the South Koreans, like everyone else, is a little cautious about the Russian market because of the role of the state in the property rights aren't really well respected. There's a lot of stuff in Russia that makes you uncomfortable about investing in the economy. But in principle, there's a natural partnership there in South Korea and Russia. The two economies, interestingly, are about the same in size if you rank them in world order in aggregate, not per capita obviously, but in terms of aggregate size. But they're very complementary. The South Koreans import mostly oil and natural gas from Russia, and then the Russians get machinery, equipment, and other technologies. It's not totally that way. The South Koreans also get defense items and civilian helicopters and other items too. The defense trade is interesting. That loan that President Roh gave in 1991, the Russians traded really couldn't pay back. So they worked out a deal in which the Russians would give South Korean weapons in return for in lieu of repaying the loans. These are now the Brown Bear Arms Debt Swap deals. There were two of them, 1995, 2003. They involved basically Soviet-era weapons systems, in fighting vehicles, tanks, anti-missile systems. The Russians would give the South Koreans complete systems. They're now negotiating a third round, and it's interesting. So it's something we should watch as this develops, because they're not going to do it as the South Koreans will pay cash. It's not going to be a waiver for the debt. The Russians agreed to pay the remaining debt over the next decade in any case. And there are arguments now over the terms. Like the Chinese, the South Koreans are not that interested in receiving complete Soviet-made, Soviet-era, Russian-made, Soviet-era type weapon systems. They want more advanced defense technologies. And so they're bargaining over what might be transferred. Talking about long-range radar systems, EMP defense systems. With the Chinese, it's very complicated. The Russians, of course, fear that if they give a lot of high technology to the Chinese will just copy it and then sell it on third-party markets under private weapons sale. I don't think that's a fear in the case of South Korea, but there's still, the technology transfer issues they want to keep an eye on. Some South Korean companies are very heavily involved in the Russian market. The Hyundai Group, in particular, is at one point selling more cars in Russia than any other firm. Samsung is also very much involved in telecommunications there. Now, if you resolve the security problem and integrate North Korea economically into the rest of East Asia, then you could expect a major increase in Russian trade. As I said, they want to set up a direct rail network, which would increase transportation costs and delivery time. As most South Korean goods now proceed by ship to Europe and other places, but if you do it by train, it may be cheaper. Now, container shipping, of course, reduces the cost significantly, but there's still some savings. Also, there might be just more security of pirates, etc. The Russians describe their economic vision for the Koreas, basically linking them, integrating them through Russia and transit country, as a contribution to the security realm. Through the economic integration, you can overcome tensions and help basically make the region more secure. Most interesting recent developments, December 2008, Russia and South Korea signed this massive natural gas deal, estimated to be worth almost $100 billion. It's being run through the state-controlled Gazprom and South Korea's Korea Gas Corporation. They originally wanted to build an overland pipeline running from far eastern region of Russia through North Korea and South Korea, but of course we know the problems are coming now with North Korea. So, and the Russians in particular are wary because they've had this, this experience with Ukraine and Belarus and other countries in Europe in which their natural gas shipments to Western Europe are being held hostage by having negotiated transit agreements with the Ukrainians and worrying about the Ukrainians running off gas. And the Ukrainians, of course, have their own complaints about the Russians, but they've indicated they don't want to deal with this North Korea. So the thinking now is maybe go for some kind of underwater pipeline, or most recently the thinking may be about just going for more liquefied natural gas, which is what we have now. There's a 2004 agreement by which Korea gets some liquefied natural gas from the Russian Far Eastern islands. The Russians now are going to renegotiate the terms because they agreed in 2004 when the price for oil, which is how they were measuring liquefied natural gas, was low, and now it's risen. The Koreans so far have rejected, but you can think of ways in which you be creative and perhaps make it in terms for a price increase, give the Koreans other side benefits, maybe more deliveries, maybe technology transfer, etc. And both countries benefit from this economic relationship in the political and military realm, I would argue. From the South Korean perspective, again, it helps give South Korea some influence over Russia, and same with the relations with China, over their policies towards Korea, because the policymakers in these countries are aware of the economic benefits they get from working with South Korea. And from Russian point of view, it helps keep them as a player in East Asia. Now, the security goals I mentioned are very much, Russia generally wants to resolve this North Korean nuclear crisis and the other problems, because if you could, you realize all these economic benefits. And they're particularly eager to develop the Russian Far East, because that region, as I said, is lagged behind what's been going on in most of the rest of Russia. And you've got, of course, this problem about the region being so close to China. The demographic imbalances, the economic imbalances are such that the Russians, in the back of their mind, always worry they're going to lose control of that region to China. So they're eager to develop it economically and get the Korean investment in there. Now, in terms of the goals, I think the important Russian goal is to prevent North Korea from having nuclear weapons. The Russians were really upset when the Koreans detonated a nuclear weapon in October 2006, less than 200 kilometers from their border. They did not like that. Putin signed a decree banning all Russian government private institutions from transferring equipment, material, or knowledge that could help the North Koreans develop nuclear weapons. The Russians supported limited sanctions. But unlike, say, Japan or the United States, the Russians don't think, they can't see a scenario where North Koreans actually use a nuclear weapon against Russia deliberately. But they are somewhat worried a bit about the loose news problem. I mean, the material could leak out, and maybe Chechen separatists, because there's somebody to get them. So they're just eager. They'd like to just lock down the whole North Korean program. And the same with the North Korean missile test. They would prefer the North Koreans not to do that. Here you've got the added problem that the Russians love to joke about the inaccuracies of these missiles. So they're worried that the North Koreans could launch a missile, aim it towards the sea of Japan, it's going to land in the Russian Far East or something. So they're particularly eager to shut this program down, or at least the testing. And they put in a lot of advanced air defenses in the Russian Far East. We know about the S-300s that the Russians supposedly are on and off against Venezuela or Iran. They use that as leverage. They actually put in more advances than the S-400 in the Russian Far East to defend, hopefully shoot down a wayward North Korean missile. But counterposed against these two goals, and one reason, of course, is they would not object to peaceful regime change or revolution, but they don't want an abrupt collapse or transformation or military action which would cause a change in North Korea's government or deepest disintegration. Like the Chinese, they're worried about the refugees. The economic consequences would be disastrous because you have source of Korean investment which would want to go to Russia, which now be sent into North Korea to try and recover Germany to try and restore that country. It eliminate the buffer zone between Russia and Russian forces and U.S. forces in the region. I suspect even Chinese investment and a bunch of other foreign investment, if it was a war, would dry up the whole area. And also, the Russian, depending on how the outcome would occur, would lose its important status as an intermediary between these countries. So Russians frequently urge restraint on all parties, including Pyongyang, but also the United States. Now, each Russian, just like each American, weighs all these concerns differently. Non-proliferation versus change in consequences. But I think in general, the Russians are more concerned about the chaos in regime than they are about Europe. And so they would be willing to live with a nuclear North Korea that was stable. That would be a preferable option to them than a North Korea that was not a nuclear state, but is also not a functioning state. And one of the reasons is goal number 4, which is the Russians want to prevent cascading proliferation of nuclear and missile defense technologies. In principle, the Russians say, well, we're one of the special countries on the non-proliferation treaty, and it's our duty to enforce the treaty, and which, of course, guarantees Russia's status as one of the unique nuclear powers. More pragmatically, what they really fear is that the North Koreans, through these launching of missiles, or these ostentatious detonations of nuclear tests, are going to drive other countries to go for nuclear weapons too. The main concern, of course, is Japan. In theory, you could think South Korea, you could see other problems. It's also, the U.S. is encouraging those countries to cooperate with the U.S. to set up all these missile defense programs that the Russians hate, and defend Japan and South Korea. Another Russian goal, as we mentioned, was to keep Russia a player. It definitely wants to be involved. And it has clear stakes, economic and military and political stakes in the outcome. They want to stay involved. And so they don't want to be shunted aside with a special deal between Pyongyang and Washington or some deal with the Chinese broke or something. They want to be a player. And so that was why they put the centrality of the six-party talks as a mechanism. Because Russia wanted to keep players there, as well as the United Nations, where Russia has a veto. And as I mentioned, they're object to direct talks between Pyongyang and Washington, but only insofar as that would help you win the six-party talks. If you step back and look at the whole East Asian security order, it's clear that Russia is very isolated, since most of the existing structures, unlike in Europe or in Eurasia, the other two areas of concern for Russia, they're mostly spoken veto combinations or bilateral relations in which the United States linked with some party there, with some limited cooperation between Japan and South Korea or Japan and but basically Russia has no other mechanism in the Far East other than the six-party talks, since the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is not dealing with this area. And as I mentioned, they think they made a mistake during the 1990s when they just sort of let their relations go in the Far East, so they're very concerned. I think if you ask what the outcome Russians might like to see is what some people refer to as the Ukrainian model. The idea here is that you induce the North Koreans to give up their nuclear program and some of their missiles and so on in return for security assurances, economic assistance, reintegration. This is better than the other two outcomes. One, the Libyan model, in which they put a lot of pressure on the government until it agrees to surrender its WMD assets to rejoin. Or worse, the Iraq model of 2003, where the international community would attack North Korea to destroy its own weapons of mass destruction. The problem is the Ukrainian and Korean cases aren't totally parallel. Ukraine just sort of ended up with the nuclear army and didn't want them, and when they became independent, just had a bunch of them on their territory. Now, for a while, they were thinking, maybe we should keep them just in case. Who knows what the Russians will do. But they, thanks to some good diplomacy on the U.S. side and other interventions, they realized it would be better security-wise to just give them up in return for becoming close to the United States, close to not moving a major source of tension with Russia. In addition, they didn't receive an imminent security threat the way I think the North Koreans do, where, you can see why the North Koreans might want nuclear weapons to ensure their security. Whereas the Ukrainians, there wasn't a really good scenario what would be the military threat. Russian bases are possible perhaps, but then, a nuclear strike in Russia would just be everybody in Ukraine, so it wouldn't make any sense. Obviously, that's true with North Korea too. They don't seem to think that way, or they don't want us to let them think that way. Another tactic Russia used to maintain itself as a major player is to serve as a bit of a mediator. And the Russians do this in other countries as well. We see this past few weeks in the Middle East. We had a Hamas go to Russia. Now President Israel is there. We are going to see soon the Palestinian Authority representative go there. Russians are bargaining with Iran. They like this idea. Everybody comes to Moscow trying to get the Russians to agree to help them deal with Palestinians or Iran or vice versa. So they like this centrality as a mediator. And to do this in the case of North Korea, as I said, Putin resumed relations with North Korea. He went there. Their basic Russian position is they're benign neutrality. They want to resolve the problems and help everybody out. And so, in addition to the food trip in July 2000, we have Lavrov, Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, was recently there too. He's trying to go. He went to North Korea, the first foreign minister from one of the six party countries aside from North Korea to go to Pyongyang after the nuclear test and missile test, and he delivered a letter to Putin and he went to South Korea. So they like this idea of stressing that they have communication with all the parties and that they can play an important role. And in fact, they did. This actually served a very useful purpose. You recall that for a while the denuclearization process was deadlocked because of the problems with the Macau Bank of Delta Asia, that the United States froze the funds in September 2005 because the money was seen to be from illegal profits, and the we wanted that money. Said, okay, we're not going to do a deal until you resolve it. And then trying to backtrack that proved too difficult in the U.S. because their Treasury, for different reasons, was uncomfortable with that. And other countries didn't want to touch it because the money was seen as legal, and they were concerned they would be affected by sanctions. But the Russian government having a lot of influence over its banks, was able to get some of them to agree, take the money from the bank, the dollar, and give it to the North Koreans through a different bank transfer. And they worked out a special deal with the U.S. So that did have a useful role, just like you could argue that principal Russia's role connection with Hamas or Iran could be useful in working out some kind of reconciliation with those governments. Now, Russians stress the necessity for dialogue over punishment. As a general rule, they don't like international sanctions. One good reason is because Russians often are subject to sanctions by the U.S. and they just don't like this idea of sanctions. They think it's best to have positive incentives to persuade governments to give in. You don't want to back them in a corner. You start sanctioning, you're just going to make things worse, is the common Russian argument. They said this about Iran and other places as well. And so they, in UN Security Council deliberations, they generally try and avoid sanctions, but they will accept them a limited role if it's a lesser evil. And under the Bush administration, they went for sanctions because they were afraid the Bush administration might resort to force otherwise. And they could block something in the Security Council with their veto, and they've used that process to water down resolutions. But their fear is if they use that too heavily, you're going to have a repeat what happened in Kosovo in 1998 and Iraq in 2003, in which the governments will just bypass the UN and set up a coalition of the willing and go in and use force, or just Russia lose all influence because the UN will no longer be a player. So they want to give in enough to keep Western or Japanese interest in the UN. So you can make sure that the UN is still in charge and they get there, so you have limited sanctions and keep the party in the UN. Don't have people act outside the UN. And we can go into the question and answer that are basically examples of how the Russians use their influence to water down sanctions, prevent use of military force to enforce them, for example, going for statements rather than broadening or adding new sanctions, etc. Russia, another way to stay state players through these joint statements with other parties, particularly the Chinese. Chinese and Russian goals overlap a lot, except for one major difference we'll get to later. So often when they get together, the Chinese and Russians will introduce parallel declarations saying we're alarmed what's happening in North Korea, we want all parties to come back and negotiating table, etc. But they've also done this with the U.S. during the April 2008 Strategic Framework Declaration when President Bush went to Sochi. North Korea occupied denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was an important part. Same with President Obama's, the declaration they signed after President Obama visited Russia last summer in July. But they also criticize the United States and some governments for these double standards. They criticize the Japanese for not fulfilling the fuel agreements that they agreed to give the North Koreans various fuel and other compensation to give up in the reactor. But then the issue of the hostage, the other keys came and disrupted that. And the Russians really have no sympathy with the Japanese, and I think they should forget about the other keys and give the North Koreans the fuel, and then that would help keep spur the process along. And they've criticized the U.S. for also not being sufficiently flexible in past negotiations. More on the portion of the Bush administration than recently. In conclusion, we're thinking about the future possibilities we might have. In the near term, Russia is clearly going to play a role in what kind of sanctions we might see if they go that route. Because of its authority status and the veto-wielding Security Council member. But also, I think the dynamics of the Russia-Chinese relationship is interesting, in that the Chinese, even if they propose something, they don't like traditionally to be the sole country to veto a UN Security Council resolution. So if the Russians indicate they'll oppose resolution over Zimbabwe or Burma or North Korea, the Chinese will go ahead and pass a double veto or support them in other ways. But if the Russians go along, then traditionally the Chinese have just abstained or something. Now, that might change over Iran. That's what everybody's wondering about now. The Russians have been much more supportive in public about adding more sanctions on Iran, fourth round sanctions, than the Chinese have. So people are wondering, will the Chinese veto even if the Russians go along? Because then the Russians can say, well, they know if the Chinese are going to veto it, they can go ahead and go along and not really suffer any consequences because the Chinese will get the appropriate. So people are watching that in Iran as an indicator of what might happen in Korea as well. Another issue we have to consider is the principle of commitment to commitment, action for action. The idea here is that you have you give the North Koreans very concrete rewards, but they would have to take very concrete steps towards denuclearization. So they do something and you reward. They do something and reward. Very tight linkage. The problem is it's also going to work in reverse, that if the North Koreans are doing bad, then they'll impose some kind of penalty. And then the North Koreans react even worse. So for example, they had their space vehicle launch, and so they were sanctioned for doing missile, for engaging in missile-related activities, and they got very angry and went and detonated nuclear weapons. So you descend downwards, and so the South Koreans in particular, but other parties as well, are thinking about maybe we should just try for a grand bargain, and then all the issues that kind of approach the Middle East people are thinking about apply here. Okay, it opens up a range of trade-offs. You could, instead of having it so focused on the nuclear issue, you could make a much broader range of trade-offs, allow North Korea to get this and this and this, and in turn to do that, and that, and that, and just basically have to make people think about the end bargain without having to go through this lengthy protracted stage of negotiations. But there's a problem in that many people just don't, it's much more harder to reach what that precise deal would be, and there's concern about implementation because it's not self-enforcing the way people thought the commitment for commitment approach was. But the Russians have said that they, in principle, are ready to make a lot of contributions to any grand bargain that may arise. This is put out by the new Russian ambassador to South Korea earlier this year. Now, in terms of, again, looking forward, I think North Korea offers a good area where the United States and Russia particularly cooperate. It's not like Iran, where you have this tension. The Russians themselves are internally divided. They have a lot of, they don't want to, I think, Iran to weak government either, but they also have a very strong arms industry and civil nuclear energy, I think, is an industry that doesn't want to sacrifice their economic ties with Iran. And they also don't want Iran to move too close to the West, because right now their industries dominate. Along with Chinese, they have the prominence over investment opportunities and trade with Iran. If there ever was to be an Iran-U.S. reconciliation, then they would lose the status, because Iranians would probably start trying the Western technology. And Afghanistan, we know there's some cooperative elements there, but there's also a bit of schadenfreude. The Russians are sometimes quite happy to see the United States go through the same Afghan mess we made them suffer a while ago. But Korea is like, both countries share the same vision, I think, of a non-nuclear, peaceful, even integrated, unification. I think the Russians have known that unification, Korea integrated global economy. Problem is there's a difference over tactics. They said the Russians won't take actions that could lead to collapse and chaos of the Korean Peninsula, even realize they go all work. Some Americans might, some Japanese might. South Koreans, I don't think. I think they're the same view as the Russians. It's just not worth it to them. So we'll have to think about that. I think we might see some way that the tension manifests itself in what's going to happen with the armistice talks we ever get there. The current U.S. position is both parties engaged in the fighting Korean War should be involved in the armistice, and that would be the United States, the Korea, and China, not Japan, not Russia. The Russians don't like that. I don't know about the Japanese. The Russians think that they should have some role, some work to them. Russians also like this idea of traditionally these geopolitical trade-offs, spheres of influence, and so they feel like, and in some supposedly, that if we make concessions in Georgia, they might be more accommodating in the case of Iran or Korea, but as we know, it doesn't play well in U.S. politics, but that's not going to be anything explicit. If we ever were to solve the North Korean problem, I think Russia could play very major contributions. They could help a lot with nuclear energy, space techniques, new scientific program to space exploration. That's something they've done with South Korea. And the North Koreans and the Chinese make more comfortable having the Russians do that and Western governments do that. If wherever we go bad, the Russians, I think, could very well see themselves sending troops into North Korea to lock down those WMD assets and have a humanitarian crisis. And the Chinese might join them, or they might just support having the Russians do it, because I think the Chinese feel more comfortable than having U.S. or South Korean troops come up north and take care of that. And they refer something like that. The 2005 exercise, when they had a joint military exercise near North Korea, in some ways could be seen as an area for that kind of a joint occupation. It had other functions too. And finally, last point, if we look even further out, the Russians, when they set up the working groups for the six-party talks, the Russians was part of the working group thinking about what kind of new security architecture we want in East Asia. As I mentioned, the Russians don't like the existing architecture because they are basically, aside from six-party talks, excluded. So they're very eager to think about how you could perhaps evolve the six-party talks model into something more permanent, some kind of more permanent security structures for Northeast Asia. Something maybe like the CSCE, not clear what, but it's something that I think the Russians have given more thought to than perhaps we have. I know for a while people were thinking about that, but we haven't really looked into that for a while. Whereas the Russians are very eager to get over the present mess and go on to what they think could be a really bright future.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Weitz. And at this point, we will open the floor for for discussion. I would ask that we try, despite our size, to keep it as informal as possible. So if you would speak up, also in identifying yourself, that way we don't have to pass around a microphone, but the camera can still pick up your question and we can still hear it. I would jump in really quickly. I have a clarification question to ask you. I really appreciate your explanation of Russia's sort of dynamic relationship with sanctions, the idea of sanctions, and its role in the UN, and when it hedges its options and makes decisions to go along with things. So with regards to June of 2009 and UN Security Council Resolution 1874, whatever their motivations were, they're on board with it, at least in the resolution side. How do you see their role in implementation playing out? We talk about China. Everybody's watching to see what China will do. Does it not matter as much? Will Russia not be sort of having to make decisions?
Right. Well, I think that unlike the Chinese, the Russians try and implement any agreement they sign internationally. The Chinese, I think, is more complex. That's not really Chinese government's fault. There's a lot of entities in China that can fully control the state-owned enterprises sometimes go off on their own to do things, which the government. But I think the Russians generally will try and enforce an international treaty or UN sanction or anything that they agree to. And so they're actually relations to PSI, Security Initiative member. So, and I'm not aware they're violating any of those. There's no report that Russia serves as an open transit route for that. So what we saw during those negotiations was just an effort to water down the term. So they were delaying efforts to expand it. They had to slow down the setting. The original resolution set up the sanctions committee, and they never did anything. And there was an effort after the latest spat of the missile test, and then to actually go ahead and buy that and actually try it. And the Russians delayed it a bit. They tried to keep the list as minimum possible, but they got it down to something they were comfortable with, in the sense that it was either that or have the U.S. go off their own and do something. I think that they will enforce, if they can, what they agreed to do. That said, that's not a major concern because the main transit hole, is China. So the Russians go along. It's not a major cost to them. But that is why they're so torn about Iran, because if they go for another round of sanctions in Iran, they will enforce it, as far as I understand. They will tend to enforce it. That's why they're very concerned about what might be applied.
Yes.
Jim Pierce, Foreign Service Institute. The last part of your presentation, you mentioned Russia's interest in any future evolving security system in Northeast Asia, and also their general interest in being seen as a player. In the six-party talks, they were given a role as chair of the Regional Security Issues Working Group. As far as I can tell, they did nothing, and maybe they didn't even try anything. Things like incidents at sea agreements or prior notification of exercises, reciprocal visits of military personnel. Why did they essentially drop the ball?
Right, as you know, each of them, everybody got the chair one, so they set up like 6 of them.
Right.
And the Russians had a lot of ambitions what they wanted to do with it, but my understanding, and I can be corrected if the Russian person here wants to take that on that, was that they ran the same problem that they couldn't implement it, and they wouldn't get an agreement on anything. So it would have been nice to see, they have a good, we have a good agreement with them on that. Other ones, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere, and primarily, I think they blamed the Japanese for getting the fight with Ukraine or the FFD issue, and that sort of stalled the whole process, because that working group wasn't meeting at all, and they thought it was contaminating that. But my understanding is that Russians like that role and they want to obtain it, and if we ever reach an area where we can start thinking what to do with these party talks after resolve. When we get to the phase 3, basically, after the implementation, so then we're going to start thinking about this more deeply. And that's where I could see Russia perhaps playing a role more significant. But in the moment, I think they've just been frustrated by not getting to specifically in the environment or getting through the prerequisites they need to be able to go on, build on that.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute of Foreign Policy Analysis. Richard, it's my impression that maybe especially after the August 2005 exercise with the Chinese and the Russians, that the implication was that the Russians would help out if the Chinese got into a conflict. For example, if they were to attack Taiwan or something, with resupply of weapons and parts and all that sort of support. If the North Koreans did something dumb and got themselves in that situation, do you think Russia would be behind them in supporting weapon systems and so forth and providing a sort of military assistance?
No, I don't think they would even do that in the Taiwan situation. The exercises were, just to review, what happened was the first time in not even didn't occur in the Soviet period, we had this major military exercise in the Russian Far East and Eastern China. There were about 8,000, I think, Chinese troops, 1,600 Russians, but the Russians were using it for a variety of purposes. One was to get the Chinese interested in buying more weapon systems, so they were showing off some of their long-range bombers, not the most advanced, and so on. But people speculate what was the purpose of the scenario, and one of them was the Taiwan scenario came up, another one was North Korea. They since held two more. They've had them every other year. The 2007 exercise was more focused in Central Asia and was more designed to put down another uprising in Uzbekistan or something like that. It was more middle range. They had a more recent exercise in 2009, and it was again in Kazakhstan. So what's changed most significantly in the Russian-China relationship is the collapse of their arms relationship. The Chinese used to be buying billions of dollars every year worth of Russian arms, and that has really shrunk. So they used to be tied with the Indians for about 40% of the Russian export market. It's now maybe down to 10%, maybe a little higher, but the Russians don't expect much. The problem is the Russians have this dilemma with the China and the arms sales that China, like the South Koreans, they pretty much bought what they wanted in terms of weapon system, complete turnkey weapon systems from that were designed in the Soviet era, tanks, aircraft, particularly destroyers. So the Russians were actually focused more on selling the Chinese naval and air platforms that could be used in a war with Taiwan or the United States. They weren't too eager to sell them stuff that might be used in a war with Russia, like tanks or something. So, but now the Chinese, they don't need that anymore. They can make their own, maybe not totally as effective, but certainly enough. They want the next step up, and the Russians are not willing to do that. They don't want to give them this new explosive fifth generation fighter. They don't want. I doubt they would tell the Chinese. They're going to do it. They've chosen India as a partner because there are multiple concerns. I mean, if there was a war with Taiwan, the Russians wouldn't want to get dragged into that, I would argue, but the fact that the Russian weapons are being used, they could be used against U.S. forces. And so we're trying to avoid that. They said they're very concerned about Chinese ability to, not necessarily reverse engineer, basically, I don't know what their term is, but basically they'll learn enough from the weapons they get from China, from Russia, to design better systems or comparable systems and sell them at a lower price. So the Chinese, for example, part of their aircraft carrier ideas, they said they wanted to buy some Russian Chinese fighter planes that could be launched from aircraft carriers. And Russia was thinking, well, we sold you 50, what would be the price? And the Chinese came back, well, we just want 2. Sell 2, and then we'll and so that was the end of that, because we know what they're going to do with them, right? So, and this has now become common with Iran, the S-300s. The Chinese have managed to build an air defense system that's not as good at the specs as the S-300, but it's not too far off. So the Iranians are saying, well, look, Russians, you don't give us the S-300, we're going to go buy the Chinese system, and then you lose the sales. And so this is another factor playing on that. So if there's a war on the Korean Peninsula, I think the Russians would be one of the most eager to stop the fighting, not to keep it going through supplies and assistance, I mean, 20 years ago, they might have liked to see the Chinese get involved so they would get beaten up, but now I just think that the last thing they want is, because they're kind of Chinese investment too in the Russian Far East. So they really don't want to avoid conflict. So that exercise, I think, was an aberration. And I think what you're seeing now is what the more likely scenario. So these biannual exercises, it's interesting that it's sort of the worst nightmare for each government. And this is under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or even bilaterally. The Chinese, when they go into it, they're thinking about tenement. How do you put down like an urban uprising? And so they send a lot of internal security troops as well as some relevant army. Whereas the Russians, their worst nightmare is something like Chechnya. So they have a bigger ambition towards sort of think of the Shanghai Cooperation in terms of military component. But I can see maybe a joint occupation in North Korea in case of chaos. But I just can't see a joint military operation against the U.S. or the ROK.
I'll get over here first.
Yes, thank you very much. Shoijito from CSIS. Thank you very much for comprehensive presentation. I'd like to make a follow-up comment to the question from the gentleman over there, and raise just one question. Well, I completely agree that Moscow rather refused from playing a vital role in the six-party talks, but I think this is exactly what they have in mind, because in other words, they want to make a commitment without obligation because they know that the knowledge is so limited. But they do need a presence over there. And today I got the information from a presentation that Russians are nervous about possible unification of the Korean Peninsula. I think they are rather happy about the unification of the Korean Peninsula because this will be the only scenario in which perhaps the Russians will be able to entrench a strong geopolitical position in Northeast Asia by extending natural gas pipeline all the way to the southmost part of the peninsula. Well, you talked about a series of energy agreement with South Korea, but none of them has yet had any substance in it. All the deals have been so rhetorical, and the Russians really understand that without the unification of the peninsula, they cannot construct trans-Korean peninsula pipeline all the way to Busan. And my question is that you mentioned that, like Chinese, the Russians are concerned about the influx of Korean refugees in case of emergencies. Well, apart from immediate economic costs, I really don't understand why they're concerned about those Korean refugees. In fact, back in 2002, the governor of Moscow, Sergei Davkin, launched a kind of political balloon saying that they are ready to establish a refugee camp for up to 100,000 North Korean refugees. And I'm not sure if he did with consent from Moscow now, but this can be one of the methods that Russia would possibly be able to play international contribution, about which everyone will be happy about.
I agree with you that the refugee issue, it's debatable even in China how important that is for them. But the Russians is probably not the main concern they would have about the war or chaos and influence, because they may have this capability to set up a major refugee camp. I'm not sure if most of the North Koreans would actually go towards Russia. They'd probably go to China or kind of go to South Korea. The Russians, the economic consequences are much more serious in the sense of what it would do to the capital flows of the region. I mean, foreign investors would stay out what money South Korea had would probably be going into trying to restructure, flowing into North Korea to revive that. And Chinese zone too would be recovering that area as well as their border regions. There's also just a whole bunch of security fears. I mean, having that loose nuclear material, chemical weapons, biological, who knows what the North Koreans have. And having that all around Russia's Far East is something that they're not very eager to see. So I think, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why Russia don't want to see a war in that. The refugees, it's probably not a major factor. I think you're right, they could probably do that. I'm not sure if Russians tell that as a contribution, though, to a resolution of the crisis. One thing I realized I forgot one thing we could do is, with respect to working, the Russians can play a role in thinking about these ideas and sharing them with the Chinese and us and helping us talk with the Chinese about these issues. Because as we know, the Chinese refuse to talk with us officially or even unofficially because they're afraid of the North Korean plan about if North Korea collapses, what are we going to do? You know, how far are U.S. troops going to go? The Chinese troops? The Chinese don't want to talk about that. But I can talk about the Russians because I think they feel comfortable enough the Russians won't leak it. The way they fear they will leak, you know, in the U.S. is Japanese. And then the Russians could tell us, and we could tell the Russians something that might go back to the. So they could play a role in us thinking about, well, if Russia can't set up a major refugee camp, that could be seen as a contribution to dealing with humanitarian crisis that can invariably arise. But I think everyone, the Russians and the are trying to strive to avoid that crisis in the first place.
Still have a question, and then we'll work our way up, actually. Yes.
Bernard Gordon, University of New Hampshire. I want you to focus on the South Korean-Russian relationship in terms of the oil, the gas transit likelihood. In the West and in Europe, of course, the United States has been concerned that the Russians may use potential leverage for foreign policy purposes. What I want to know is whether, from your understanding of the South Korean perspective, there is a particular concern on that, because I've been told, I don't know if this is true or not, that Putin's own doctrine was on that subject, the use of Russia's natural resources as a foreign policy tool. After all, it's almost all that Russia in this era has to export its natural gas and so on. So from the Korean perspective, is there much evidence of that kind of concern being dependent upon Russian gas as a political weapon at all?
A couple interesting points to rise from that. First, you're very right, the Russians, there's a tradition saying in Russia that their two strongest allies, you know, their czars, their strongest allies were the Russian Navy and the Russian Army. Under Soviet period, it was Russian nuclear forces. Now their superpower status is their oil and gas. So yes. Putin's dissertation, according to scholars at the Carnegie and Brookings who looked at this, he copied most of it from some Western sources. He just copied all things. I'm not sure how much he really believes that or so on. But it's certainly accurate that he believes that. You know, the way
He does.
Right. So I wouldn't necessarily go to just kind of look more at his behavior. And certainly there's evidence that he sees the natural resources as a means for sustaining Russia's superpower status, or great power status. South Koreans, I don't know. I know they think it actually in reverse, that developing that kind of relationship would give them leverage over the Russians, because that would influence Russia's policies towards the Koreas. How much the country would suffer from a natural gas crisis, how that would affect their, I mean, the Russians are right, could theoretically use that to pressure the South Koreans into making concessions with North Korea for a settlement. I'm not aware if that is a concern, but there are probably people here who know more about the South Korean thing than I do, so Anderson has a perspective. I just know about the other group, how they see this means to influence Russia. Does anyone have any data on that, or thinking? Maybe something you should have a study on that. Think about what are the South Koreans thinking about that now.
Yes, sir.
Michael Yehuda from UW. In your talk and answer, you outlined relationship between China and Russia. So in one sense, it has an enormous overlaps in interests. But on the other hand, there's a rather uneasy relationship as well. And given the overlap of the relationship with the North, and especially their deep-seated interest in not seeing the collapse of the North, what's the only evidence that they coordinate their activities at all, or their diplomacy at all, around the six-party talks, or on the margins of it? Or they kept separate?
Excellent question. I actually wrote a book on that a couple of years ago, China-Russia relations. I think it's called Parallelism Without Attachment as a subtitle, because no, they, for the most part, eat with respect to everywhere in the world, except Central Asia for the most part. They go off, they have parallel interests, they pursue similar policies, but they don't coordinate them well. Even when you think they might, like, for example, opposing U.S. ballistic missile defense initiative or dealing with Iran, they tend to just stick in their own lane. And as far as I can tell, and the North Koreans encourage this, they don't want to have to deal with them together, they like dealing with them separately. They, through the six-party talks, and they talk about it bilaterally, but I see no evidence that they're actually coordinating their policies towards North Korea or South Korea. You could argue different reasons why, but that's not happening.
We have Bosnia consultant. I do a lot of work with the Japanese, and the feeling I get is this adoptee issue is just so emotional with them that it's not something to let go of. Do you think that either the Russians or the Chinese will have influence to get the North Koreans eventually to somehow resolve the situation with Japan, and if so, will they use it?
Russian position is get over it. Russia lost 20 million people in World War II. They've had later season abductees, and they've had Russian season abductees. It's not a big deal. South Koreans have had many more abductees than the Japanese, and they're not making this a big deal. Why are you Japanese doing this? So the Russians have no sympathy for this whatsoever, and so they're and you're right. You talk to Japanese business, it's their heartfelt issue, and so that's just one of many sources of tension in Japan. Different perspectives, more concrete differences. So bottom line is the Russian position is the Japanese have to just get over it. And the Japanese aren't going to go for that, at least when the Russians are in that. I don't know what the U.S. might play a role because Americans are sympathetic, but there's also this idealist strain about we got to deal with the nuclear problems, the main priority. The North Koreans, why they're not coming into it odd too, because it's not. You would think it's not that. You think they do want to get the Japanese assistance to get over it, but whatever they did to those people, they don't want it to come out. So they're keeping that quiet.
David, so I was wondering if you could say what the Russian view is of the U.S. alliance with South Korea.
Right.
If we ever get to the longer term unification phase, whether they see a U.S. Military presence in unified Korea or anywhere else.
Right. Yeah. Interesting issue, as we know, they're very conflicted about the U.S.-Japan relationship. It's dominantly negative, but they do see some positive elements, could be some restraints, not supporting Japan's suppression of nuclear weapons. South Korea, they haven't objected to it per se. I've seen no effort to try and disrupt that alliance directly. They would certainly not want to see, though, a joint command or U.S. forces move north if there was reunification or under any circumstances. They probably would accept for South Korean initiative. So my guess is they're happy about the devolution, even though they don't think it's proceeding fast enough. On the other side, the transfer of U.S. military functions on the Korean peninsula from the United States to the Korean. There's some suspicion that it's for show a bit, that the Americans still going to entertain a major role. But it's not, it hasn't kind of been a source of major concern the way the U.S.-Japan alliance is. Because they're really focusing now on the joint missile defense effort. They seem to think now with the Obama administration is the Japanese are more enamored by missile defenses than any other country in the world. So they're driving some of these programs, and they're not happy about that. certainly don't want to see the Japanese get the F-22 and a bunch of other things. But the South Koreans, no, I think there are probably a lot of benefits of this economic reconciliation as they become much more comfortable with South Koreans. And I think that they actually appreciate the South Koreans being somewhat for their own on the Korean issue. Wanting to eliminate nuclear weapons, but not willing to risk chaos to get that objective. In addition, another source, positive source, unlike the Chinese, where I think they're still very ambiguous, I think the Russians would favor reunification of Korea under peaceful means, because it would really help their economic situation, and in theory could contribute to a reduction of the U.S. military presence on the peninsula, depending on how, through peaceful means.
Yes, Dr.
Just a quick one. Let me speak for a moment as a political economist. You use the term in your discussion, complementary economics between the two, Russia and Korea. Superficially, yes, but when we look at from the Korean perspective, it's really a classic colonial relationship in which the Koreans provide all of the manufactured goods and the Russians are there to provide basic raw materials. I mean, it's a small point, but I think that maybe be careful with the complementary use, but nothing more than
the
that.
relation I know better is the Russia-China, and that's really the case. That the Chinese now, the only thing they see the Russians for is a source of raw materials for their, oil and gas, and because the Russians aren't willing to give them the top of the line military technology and nuclear energy. For some reason, it is a bit more complicated because the Russians are helping them with their space program. They provide the main booster. They're giving them some nuclear technology. I believe a lot of the uranium fuel that the South Korean reactors use comes from Russia. Defense technology. So it's not. The Russians clearly gripe to no end about what's happening in their relationship with China, because it really looks like they're just a raw material appendage to the Chinese. Where I don't see that problem yet in the case of the Russia-South Korea relationship. In part, the reason you raised before that the oil and gas is seen as a source of strength. But okay, you're probably right. I need to. One of the things we'll have to do when I revise it is to give a better term of complementary.
Yeah, if we could go back to the question of the armistice. I guess Russia right now wouldn't be considered a party to that discussion.
That's my impression that U.S. policy established from the.
But would ultimately Russia have to be involved in that?
They weren't a party to the war. They're not, and the war is still normally active. They're not a party to it. So, depending how you find it, no, it would just be. You want to keep the
It's part
minimum
of the
number.
UN, aren't they part of the Security Council?
Right, they might adopt it, but they're they were never part of the UN command that went to war against North Korea. The U.S. position, unless there might have evolved under the Obama administration. I remember under the Bush administration, it was going to be just the parties of the conflict, and I imagine the Japanese aren't too happy about that either. But they probably won't complain the way the Russians might. I'm not sure if that's a good idea for the reasons you raised. I think just letting the Russians sign on to the armistice, as long as there's no other cost, I would think that would be nice to Russia, let them acknowledge the status without necessarily causing any problems. But I can see if you're a U.S. negotiator having to deal with an armistice, you want to keep it as clean as possible from players. I don't know, we have some state farm people here. I mean, I don't know if there's that is still the current position.
That's my recollection,
Yeah.
but it's primarily between North and South Korea and the parts that are vulnerable.
Right.
Well, we could certainly keep going. Before I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Weitz for this incredibly valuable presentation and paper, I'd just like to tell you that on March 24th, we'll be hosting our next paper presentation in the series. There's a calendar out front. That paper will be on domestic and international politics of spent nuclear fuel in South Korea. The subtitle is "Are We Approaching Meltdown?" and that is by 3 authors affiliated with the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies here at the Monterey Institute, including
my last offer.
He's got a quarter plus for that. He's really good. I use this stuff a lot for screening. He's one of the people I know in the world has been screening processing and looking patients that are concentration, so it should be a great show.
So we'll see you all there, and thank you for that. And please join me in thanking Dr. Weitz for such a valuable